The laughter cut through the naval base corridor like shattered glass on concrete. Lieutenant Jake Morrison, 28 years old with 6 years as a Navy SEAL and an ego that could fill the Pacific Ocean, was clearly reveling in his own wit. "Hey there, what's your rank?" he called out, his voice dripping with mockery. "Private latte?" His 5 teammates erupted in laughter, transforming the hallway into a theater of toxic masculinity masquerading as military brotherhood. At the epicenter of this storm of disrespect stood a 34-year-old black woman, motionless and composed. Colonel Diana Washington, though nobody on that base knew her true identity yet, employed the box-breathing technique she'd mastered over 15 years of military service. For seconds in, for seconds hold, for seconds out, for seconds hold. "Sorry, I didn't quite catch your answer," Morrison continued, circling closer like a shark sensing blood in the water. "Or maybe you haven't learned how to read rank insignia yet. I know the Army has special programs for people like you." Diana had arrived at Naval Base Norfolk 3 days earlier. Her official purpose, a routine inspection of specialized training facilities. Her actual mission, investigating allegations of systematic discrimination and abuse of authority that had reached the desk of the Secretary of Defense himself. What Morrison couldn't have known, what none of these men could have imagined, was that Diana wasn't just another black woman trying to survive in a hostile military environment. She was the officer who had commanded classified operations across 3 continents. She had saved the lives of senators during missions that would never appear in any newspaper. The decorations on her dress uniform represented achievements most of these soldiers could only fantasize about. "Look at this, guys," Morrison announced loudly, ensuring other passing soldiers could hear. "We got someone here who doesn't even know where she is. Probably got lost looking for the kitchen or the laundry room." For a brief moment, Diana lowered her gaze. Morrison and his crew interpreted this as submission, as confirmation that they'd successfully put another upstart in her place. They couldn't see what she was actually doing. Memorizing every face, every name on every uniform tag, every word that would later be used as evidence when the time came. Because Diana Washington wasn't merely an investigator. She was an architect of justice. And justice, she'd learned throughout her 15-year career, sometimes required the surgical precision of a military operation. "Maybe we should teach our new visitor some basic rules," Morrison continued, savoring each syllable of contempt. "Rule number 1, this is SEAL territory. Rule number 2, people like you take orders, you don't give them." Diana finally lifted her eyes. Her gaze met Morrison's with tranquility that stirred something deep in the Navy SEAL's subconscious, a primal instinct whispering that perhaps he was making a catastrophic mistake. But Morrison's arrogance outweighed his instincts. "Rule number 3, he continued, now practically whispering in her ear, "stay in your lane. Because if you try to get smart with me, I'll make sure your experience here is educational." "Understood," Diana replied calmly. Her voice was controlled, carrying an undertone Morrison couldn't quite identify. Very educational indeed. Over the following 3 days, Morrison transformed Diana's existence into a meticulously orchestrated hell. He'd spread his coffee soldier joke throughout the entire base. Now every meal in the mess hall, every corridor transit, every moment in public spaces became an exercise in collective humiliation. "Look who's here," Morrison would announce whenever Diana entered a room. "Our expert in, what was your job again? Oh, that's right, nobody knows." What wounded Diana most deeply weren't the direct insults. She'd endured far worse during her 15 years of service. What cut deepest was witnessing other soldiers, including some women and minorities, either laugh along or avert their eyes, terrified of becoming Morrison's next target. Morrison had developed a sadistic system. When Diana sat down for meals, he'd approach with his entourage and begin interrogating her about basic military protocols in a theatrical voice, as though she were a confused civilian who'd accidentally wandered onto the base. "Tell us," he'd demand, relishing every second, "what's the standard procedure for equipment inspection? Or is that too advanced for someone in your field?" Diana answered every question with technical precision that would have impressed any military veteran. But Morrison twisted her correct responses into punchlines, imitating her voice or feigning exaggerated astonishment. "Wow. Someone memorized a manual. Such dedication. What Morrison didn't know was that Diana had commanded operations where a single protocol error could cost American soldiers their lives. She knew these manuals because she'd helped rewrite portions of them after missions that would never appear in public records. During her evening walks around the base, a habit she maintained to process stress, Diana mentally cataloged every incident, every witness, every detail that could serve as evidence later. Her memory had been trained to retain accurate information under extreme pressure, a skill that saved her life multiple times in hostile territory. On the fourth day, Morrison escalated to a dangerous level. During morning physical training, he deliberately collided with Diana hard enough to make her stumble in front of the entire company. "Careful there, soldier," he announced loudly, mock concern dripping from his voice. The Army doesn't provide insurance for accidents involving visitors. But it was on Friday that Morrison made his first critical error. During lunch, he approached Diana's table carrying his tray and accidentally spilled orange juice across her military uniform. "Jesus, how clumsy of me!" he exclaimed, making a theatrical show of dabbing at her with napkins. "But look, now your uniform has some color. It suits you better." The cafeteria erupted in laughter. But this time, Diana did something different. Instead of standing and leaving as she had before, she remained seated. She calmly took napkins, methodically cleaned the liquid, and looked Morrison directly in the eyes. "Accidents happen," she said evenly, "especially with people who don't pay attention to where they're stepping." Something in her tone made Morrison's brow furrow. There was a subtle authority there, a confidence that didn't align with the inferior position he'd assigned her. For a fleeting moment, he had the unsettling sensation that he was being evaluated, studied, cataloged for future reference. "Of course, accidents happen." He recovered his arrogance quickly. "Some are more preventable than others." Diana smiled, not a smile of submission or nervousness, but something Morrison couldn't quite decipher. "True," she replied. "Some accidents are perfectly preventable. All it takes is a little more situational awareness from the person responsible." She stood, disposed of her tray, and exited the cafeteria with the impeccable posture of someone who'd received rigorous military training. Morrison watched her go, part of him registering inconsistencies his arrogance refused to properly process. That night, in her modest quarters, Diana opened a laptop that officially shouldn't have been in her possession. The screen displayed reports from multiple military installations documenting systematic patterns of discrimination, harassment, and abuse of authority. Morrison's case was merely one among dozens, but there was something about a particular brand of systematic cruelty that distinguished it from the others. She opened a specific file, Norfolk Naval Base Behavioral Investigation. Inside were photographs, discreetly recorded audio transcripts, time-stamped incident logs, testimonies from soldiers who'd endured similar treatment, and most importantly, a detailed pattern analysis showing how Morrison weaponized his position to systematically destroy the morale of anyone he deemed different or inferior. Diana had meticulously documented every interaction over the past 5 days. Not just the obvious confrontations, but the subtle ones too. How Morrison altered his body language around senior officers, how he selected his victims, how he ensured witnesses to performances while avoiding direct evidence of harassment. She rapidly typed an updated report, attached the evidence she compiled, and transmitted it through encrypted channels to an address that officially didn't exist. Within 24 hours, very powerful people will be reviewing every word, every image, every second of audio. What Morrison didn't know, what nobody on that base knew, was that Diana Washington hadn't arrived there by chance. 3 senators had received confidential reports about systematic toxic environments in military facilities. A 4-star general had lost sleep contemplating how American soldiers were being broken not by foreign enemies, but by their own comrades. And when injustices reached that level of governmental attention, people like Diana were deployed not merely to document problems, but engineer definitive solutions. Every humiliation Morrison inflicted wasn't only witnessed by terrified soldiers in the mess hall. It was being recorded, analyzed, and cataloged by one of the most decorated military investigators in American history, a woman who'd survived interrogations by international terrorist organizations and now needed to employ those same survival skills against the very military she'd served with distinction. While everyone laughed at that cafeteria incident, nobody noticed how Diana had memorized every face, every name on every uniform tag, every person who chose to actively participate in the humiliation or simply stood by in complicit silence. Because some people learn early that true strength doesn't lie in reacting immediately to provocation. It lies in patiently constructing a case so ironclad that when justice finally arrives, it will be absolute and irreversible. The following Monday, Morrison decided to elevate his humiliation campaign to what he considered an educational level. During the morning briefing with the entire company, he deliberately seated Diane in the front row and began quizzing her on basic safety procedures as though testing a child. "Tell us all," Morrison announced with a cruel smile. "What's the standard protocol for entering a combat zone? Or is that too technical for visitors?" Diana responded with absolute military precision, citing not only standard protocols, but specific variations for different terrain types and threat scenarios. Her answer was so detailed and technical that several experienced officers exchanged surprised glances. Morrison, irritated at failing to catch her in an error, decided to attack from another angle. Impressive. Someone really memorized a manual. How about demonstrating it practically? He gestured toward a state-of-the-art military communications device. Configure this radio to a secure tactical frequency without consulting instructions. What Morrison didn't know was that Diana had operated far more sophisticated equipment during classified missions. She approached the device and in less than 30 seconds not only configured it correctly, but established encrypted communication with 3 different bases simultaneously. The silence in the room was palpable. Soldiers began whispering among themselves. Morrison felt a flicker of uncertainty for the first time, but his arrogance exceeded his prudence. "Beginner's luck," he muttered, though his voice had lost some of its previous confidence. It was at that moment Diana decided to plant the first seed of her strategy. "Lieutenant Morrison," she said calmly, "may I ask a question about command procedures?" "Of course," he replied, reassuming his arrogant posture. "Education is always welcome. In your experience, what's the protocol when a senior officer identifies themselves after a period of covert observation of base operations?" The question landed like a silent bomb. Morrison frowned, clearly confused about her angle. That would depend on the specific situation. "Why do you ask?" "Professional curiosity," Diana replied with an enigmatic smile that unsettled several officers present. That afternoon, Diana received an unexpected visitor. General Patricia Hayes, a 52-year-old black woman and one of the highest-ranking officers on base, appeared at her quarters unannounced. "May I come in?" Hayes asked, though her tone indicated it wasn't exactly a request. Diana invited her inside, maintaining her facade as an ordinary visitor. But Hayes studied her with experienced eyes that had witnessed countless battles and evaluated countless soldiers over 3 decades of military service. "You know," Hayes began, settling into the only available chair, "there's something about you that's been bothering me for days. I couldn't identify it until this morning." Diana remained silent, allowing the general to lead. "Your posture, the way you speak, the way you configured that communications equipment." Hayes paused significantly. "I recognize advanced military training when I see it, the kind you don't acquire in basic courses." For a moment, the 2 women studied each other in silence. Diana made a calculated decision. "General Hayes, I assume you hold clearance for classified information?" "I do." Diana opened her laptop and, after a series of biometric verifications that made Hayes raise her eyebrows, displayed a screen that made the general straighten in her chair. "My God," Hayes whispered, reading the credentials. "Colonel Diana, Washington. Special Operations. You've been officially deceased for 2 years. Officially, yes. Operationally, I'm very much alive and working." Hayes leaned back, processing the revelation. Undercover investigation. Morrison and this entire situation. You're documenting everything, every word, every action, every moment of systematic abuse. Not just Morrison, but the institutional pattern that enables this behavior. He has no idea what he's done, does he? Hayes began to smile, but it was the kind of smile that appears when someone realizes justice is approaching. Not just Morrison, Diana clarified. I've uncovered a network of toxic behavior spanning multiple installations. Officers protecting other officers, creating environments where discrimination isn't merely tolerated but actively encouraged. Diana showed Hayes her evidence. Audio recordings, photographs, detailed incident reports, testimony from soldiers who'd suffered similar treatment, and most crucially, statistical patterns proving systematic discrimination. This material, Hayes said, still processing the documentation scope, will reach Congress. It goes further than that. 3 Senate committees, the Secretary of Defense, and the President himself will receive comprehensive reports. We're discussing structural reforms across the entire U.S. military system. Hayes was silent for a long moment. What do you need from me? Simply continue being an observer. Morrison will escalate further in the coming days. Men like him always do when they sense they're losing control. When he makes his final mistake, I need credible witnesses present. Final mistake? Diana smiled. And there was something in that expression that made Hayes understand why this woman had survived classified operations and missions that had killed less prepared soldiers. Morrison is going to attempt to publicly humiliate me during Friday's ceremony. I know because I intercepted communications with his associates. They're planning what they consider the final blow to put me in my place. How do you know that? Because arrogant men always follow predictable patterns. And because I have access to technology he doesn't even dream exists. On Thursday, Morrison set his final trap. During lunch, he approached Diana's table with his entire crew and a civilian dignitary visiting the base. The local mayor, there for an official visit. Mayor Johnson, Morrison announced loudly, ensuring the entire cafeteria could hear. I'd like to introduce you to our special visitor. Perhaps you can explain to her how things work in the real world, since she seems somewhat lost in a military environment. The mayor, a 60-year-old man clearly uncomfortable with the situation, extended his hand politely. Pleased to meet you, Ms. Washington. Diana shook his hand calmly. Likewise. And what is your role here at the base? The mayor asked, attempting cordiality. Morrison preempted with a laugh. That's an excellent question. We're still trying to figure that out ourselves. She appeared here a few days ago, claiming to be conducting some kind of inspection. But as you can see, he gestured theatrically, not exactly the typical profile for that kind of work. The mayor appeared increasingly uncomfortable, recognizing he was being instrumentalized to publicly humiliate someone. Actually, Diana said, her voice maintaining its calm tone but now carrying a subtle authority that commanded attention, my role here is quite specific. I'm conducting a comprehensive behavioral assessment for a Senate committee investigating patterns of institutional discrimination in military facilities. Morrison laughed loudly. Of course you are, and I'm the Secretary of Defense. Interesting that you mentioned the Secretary of Defense, Diana replied, maintaining direct eye contact, because my final report lands on his desk this Friday. Something in her delivery made Morrison stop laughing. There was conviction in her voice, a certainty that didn't align with the vulnerable position he'd assumed she occupied. Bluff, he said, but his voice had lost some of its swagger. Diana opened her bag, extracted an encrypted military phone that was decidedly not standard civilian equipment, and dialed a number. General Hayes, this is Washington. Could you join us in the cafeteria momentarily? I believe it's time for some formal introductions. The entire cafeteria had fallen silent. Everyone watching the conversation that had clearly deviated from Morrison's expected script. 5 minutes later, General Hayes entered the cafeteria in full dress uniform, her stars gleaming under the fluorescent lights. She walked directly to Diana's table, and what happened next made Morrison feel as though the floor were collapsing beneath him. Hayes stopped beside the table and, with all the military formality 3 decades of service had instilled in her, did something nobody in that cafeteria would ever forget. She saluted Diana, a full, formal, respectful military salute, the kind of salute a general renders only to someone of equal or superior rank. Colonel Washington, Hayes announced clearly, her voice carrying across the silent cafeteria. I am profoundly sorry for the treatment you received during your assignment here. I assure you that corrective measures will be implemented immediately." Morrison stood frozen, mouth agape, his face cycling through disbelief, horror, and the dawning realization that he'd spent an entire week publicly humiliating a superior officer. Not just superior, someone whose rank exceeded everyone else on that base, including the installation commander himself. The silence in the cafeteria was absolute. Every person present was processing what they'd just witnessed. The Navy SEAL who'd spent days calling a black woman a coffee soldier and questioning her qualifications had just discovered she was literally his superior. Diana stood calmly, returned Hayes a salute with the precision of someone who'd spent 15 years perfecting military protocols, then turned to Morrison with an expression combining military professionalism with absolute coldness. "Lieutenant Morrison," she said, her voice now carrying the full authority of her true rank, "I believe you have some explaining to do. Not just to me, but to Senate Committee, the Secretary of Defense, and every soldier on this base who witnessed your behavior these past few days." It was in that moment, while everyone processed a revelation, that something unexpected began taking shape. Not just in the stunned cafeteria, but primarily in the determined look now shining in Diana's eyes with an intensity that made some present realize this moment of revelation was merely the beginning of something far greater. Something that would transform not only their lives, but the entire culture of that military installation forever. The cafeteria remained in absolute silence for exactly 15 seconds. Then Morrison found his voice, trembling and desperate. "That's impossible," he muttered, recoiling as though Diana were an apparition. You were like a regular contractor or something." "Lieutenant Morrison," Diana said, her voice now carrying the full weight of 15 years of military command, "you spent an entire week questioning my qualifications, my competence, and my presence on this base. Would you like to explain that behavior to everyone here?" Morrison looked around desperately, seeking support from his fellow SEALs, but they had retreated, physically distancing themselves as though his disgrace were contagious. "I didn't know. Nobody informed me about," he stammered. "About what exactly?" Diana opened her briefcase and extracted a tablet. "About the fact that calling a senior officer a coffee soldier constitutes serious insubordination? Or about the fact that racial discrimination is a crime under military code?" She activated the screen, and her voice cut through the silence like a blade. The audio recording began to play, Morrison's own voice echoing to the cafeteria. "Hey there, what's your rank?" "Private latte." Audible gasps came from several tables. Some soldiers lowered their heads, ashamed they'd laughed the first time. "I have 7 hours of recordings." Diana continued calmly. "Every insult, every joke, every moment you abused a position of power you believed you possessed. I also have statements from 17 soldiers who witnessed your behavior but were too frightened to report it." Morrison attempted one last desperate gambit. "You were undercover. This is entrapment. You provoked me deliberately." General Hayes stepped forward, her expression glacial. "Lieutenant, are you suggesting you were compelled to make racist comments? That someone forced you to publicly humiliate a woman for an entire week?" "I just thought she was..." Morrison stopped, realizing every word only excavated his grave deeper. Diana displayed another screen on her tablet. Complete records from the SEAL's private messaging group. "The little black girl won't last a week. Let's teach this visitor her place." 16 documented messages inciting organized discrimination. Morrison's face had turned ashen. His fellow SEALs continued backing away, some whispering with horrified expressions. "Colonel Washington," General Hayes asked formally, "what is your disciplinary recommendation?" Diana closed the tablet with a decisive click. Full court-martial. "Charges: insubordination, racial discrimination, conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline, and creation of a hostile environment. Additionally, I recommend investigation of the entire group implicated in the documented messages." Morrison finally exploded, the reality of his situation hitting him like a sledgehammer. "This will destroy my career. 15 years of service. You can't." "I didn't destroy your career, Lieutenant," Diana replied with icy calm. "You did that yourself. One racist joke at a time. I simply documented it." General Hayes signaled to the MPs present. Lieutenant Morrison, you are under arrest for violating Article 134 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. You will be escorted to detention pending formal investigation. As the MPs approached, Morrison made one final desperate appeal, looking directly at Diana. I'm sorry. I didn't know who you were. If I had known. Diana cut him off with a voice that penetrated deeper than any scream could. That's exactly the problem, Lieutenant. You felt entitled to treat me that way because you thought I was vulnerable. You thought there would be no consequences. Your regret isn't for being cruel. It's for getting caught. The handcuffs clicked around his wrists. Morrison was escorted from the cafeteria in total silence, his footsteps echoing like hammer blows on a military career's coffin. Diana turned to the remaining soldiers, her expression softening slightly. Let this serve as a lesson to all of you. Military excellence has no color. Leadership has no gender. And dignity is not a privilege. It is the right of every human being who wears this uniform. As the cafeteria slowly returned to life, nobody could have imagined that this moment of justice was merely the first domino in an investigation that would transform protocols at military installations across the country, proving that sometimes true strength lies not in shouting the loudest, but in allowing the truth to speak for itself. 6 months later, Colonel Diana Washington returned to Naval Station Norfolk, but this time as the new commander of quality and diversity for Naval Atlantic Command. Her office overlooked the same cafeteria where she'd been humiliated, now displaying decorations that chronicled an extraordinary career. Morrison had been convicted in a full court-martial and dishonorably discharged from the military. He'd lost not only his 15-year career, but also his military pension and veteran benefits. His former SEAL colleagues crossed streets to avoid him when they encountered him in town. He's working at a car wash now. General Hayes mentioned during a meeting he attempted to enlist in the National Guard in another state, but his record followed him. Diana's investigation had expanded nationwide. 16 officers at 7 different installations were prosecuted for systematic discrimination. 3 bases implemented mandatory training programs on respect and diversity. Congress passed the Washington Act, legislation creating direct channels for reporting military discrimination without reprisals. On the first anniversary of what had become known as the cafeteria incident, Diana received an unexpected call. Colonel Washington, this is Sarah Chun, journalist with CNN. We're preparing a special report on your case. Could you share how you feel knowing your courage has inspired change throughout the military system? Diana smiled, remembering the frightened young woman she'd once been, facing prejudice at every promotion. I feel that justice isn't a destination, it's a daily journey. Every person who stands against injustice makes the world incrementally better. That afternoon, she received a handwritten letter from a young black soldier at a base in Texas. Colonel, thank you for showing me that our dignity is worth more than the approval of those who despise us. I reported a discrimination case here, and thanks to your example, I had the courage to refuse being treated as less than human. Diana filed the letter in a special folder. It already contained 347 similar letters from soldiers who'd found their voice through her story. That evening, passing to the now multicultural and respectful cafeteria, she remembered the words Morrison had shouted on his arrest day. This will destroy my career. He was right. His military career was finished. But Diana had learned something fundamental. True victory isn't destroying those who harmed you. It's building a future where others don't have to endure the same injustice. Morrison lost everything because he chose to see difference where he should have seen camaraderie. Diana gained everything because she chose to transform humiliation into purpose, discrimination into systematic change. Some people try to break our dignity. Others choose to protect it. That difference determines not only who we are, but what kind of world we leave behind.